Hi, Joe Bob. Greetings from the Far East. My students love the reviews you give of Chuck Norris films, and they want you to know that Japan isn't just Godzilla anymore. While last night that drive-in classic Dawn of the Dead was on primetime TV, it was uncut, but listening to it in Japanese, you hear new instead of brains. Joe Bob, it seems all the movies are dubbed over into Japanese, which makes me believe the USA still leads in drive-in movie technology.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Here we go again.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadrome. This is Burn Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, on a kind of drippy day here in Tbilisi. Well, today what we've got is another video that I originally put on my Anadromist channel, but it belongs over here, and that is a video I made as part of my Anecdotes series over there about movie experiences that I had in theaters. And one of the things I will be discussing and arguing essentially is that movies seen in theaters have had a great deal of impact on me that the same movie would not have in a, well, just watching it on, at home, certainly not on a phone. Does anything have an effect on you on the phone except a kind of mindless drone? Well, before we do and get into this, I just want to tell you and remind you that I have this weird book of 3 puppet plays, and I'm trying to raise money for the channel. I can't get any YouTube support because I live in Georgia, my bank's in Alaska, it's a long story. This channel so far has had no specific support. And if you really want to support the channel, buying a book. And in fact, write book, the word book and anadrome, and I'll know it came from this channel. So there's a link below, PayPal or even GoFundMe. Although PayPal is better because it includes the address for me to send it to you. There are a couple of books I do need to send. If you haven't gotten yours yet, patience. Let's get into the movie theater experience, the big screen, strange crowds, films with a real impact. Let's do that now. Today we're going to talk about movies and my experiences with movies. Now, I'm not talking about what movies I like the most, or my favorite, or the most important movies I've ever seen, but rather the experiences going to see movies or seeing them in some manner, mostly going to see them. And I'll explain why near the end. Before we get into it, a few things. By the way, I have another channel of my Georgian Crossroads channel, and I would recommend going and watching the differences between Georgians and Americans. And by the way, if you're wondering, well, aren't Georgians Americans? Wrong Georgia. This is the one that's at the very Asian end of Europe. And but go check that out. It's kind of humorous. Next, I'd like to remind you that I do have videos I've been dropping lately, more interview videos, and more people need to go check those out. And I've got a great discussion with Joe from the Netherlands about design and architecture and the effect of time upon how we build things and our living in time and how that's reflected through ornamentation and texture and things like this. I highly recommend that. Also, great dialogue about whither Christian music, and that's with Laura, otherwise known as That Laura Person. And we had a great discussion about where is Christian music going, where has it been recently, why is it in the shape it's in, which I'll give you a spoiler warning here, not too good, very commercialized. And I think if you're at all concerned about either Christianity or music or both, you should go watch that. And then finally, I've got one with Teddy from Israel. And we discuss, among other things, discussing what he's doing in Israel, which is fascinating in itself, but discussing particularly how does one have a conversation? And this is a fascinating subject for him, and it's a fascinating conversation to have. What are the elements of a conversation? What makes a good conversation versus one that's where two people are just talking past each other? So do that, and also, as long as you're here, if you like this video and other videos I've made, do like and share and subscribe and comment. Those things are all important because my videos don't get a lot of traction with the YouTube algorithms, and if you want to help them to do so, that's one way to help them if you like what I'm doing with this channel. Another thing you can do is choose to give a bit, and that is very important, and there's a link down below for doing that. Well, let us go now, and we're going to talk about my film experience, well, not film experiences, that implies I'm in the industry, my movie-going experiences for the most part, how I was exposed to movies. So, I don't remember any movies up till about 4 or 5 years old. And one of the things about that that's really important is that was about the year 1959 or so, when we moved from Seattle, Washington, where I was born, to Honolulu, Hawaii, before there were any skyscrapers. And what's also very important about this was television, especially in Hawaii, was very much still in its infancy. And I remember very strange things on the television channels then. I remember that television programs, you had these little, what we call rabbit ears, the antennas on top of your television set, and you'd have to move them around, but just as often, static would drift in and out of the screen. And looking back, the effect of that static on the screen really was interesting to me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. The idea of this like almost pirated broadcast coming to you. I remember Vampira's Shock Theater, and Vampira was before Elvira. There was Vampira, and she was kind of a tribute to that. But she was a vampire-esque pre Morticia Addams kind of figure, and she did these strange introductions, to horror films. But I never really watched the horror films. I just remember kind of peering through the static, because evidently this channel was tough to get. But it was peering through the static that kind of was what I took with me. Also, what was very strange was because Hawaii has a lot of Asian people, I remember watching it just seemed totally normal to watch these very strange Japanese samurai television shows. There were these samurai serials, and they were never subtitled or anything. It was just all in Japanese. But I would follow along with them later in life when I discovered The Seven Samurai and Akira Kurosawa and things like that. I would be, but there was this whole aesthetic to these things, all the rice walls and the guys with the top knots and all this stuff. But it was all done on a shoestring budget. you could tell it was just like studio rooms. When I think back on it, I even remember that effect. And then there would be the occasional thing you would see on television. This was the period when television first started showing movies. For instance, we saw King Kong, and then there was the Son of Kong. Son of Kong I actually remember more than King Kong during this period, because I guess they had the rights to it more, and they would show it often. At the end, King Kong's drowning, the Son of Kong's drowning, and it's just his fingers left, and there's a woman on the end of it, and she's saved by a boat or something like that. And The Wizard of Oz was shown once a year, and I started seeing it there, and it was just like a cheap, black and white, scuzzy quality viewing. But I remember these things. Later, I would see these things on big screens, and that was a different experience. But here's the interesting thing. More than remembering much of what was on television, I remember the movies I saw. Now, I think for many people living today, what they remember most about movies they've seen are things on television. But what I remember most of my initial movie experiences were all in movie theaters in Hawaii. And that included drive-in movie theaters. So I remember, okay, this is really bizarre. One of the first films I saw that I remember in this, it was like a 4-year period I was in Hawaii. I can remember all the movies I saw in Hawaii, maybe not all of them, but an awful lot, much more than I can later. I remember so many of these films because they're the first films I ever saw, and they're huge. They're like, 50 feet tall, I don't know, 20 meters high or something. It's just incredibly huge. The screens were not, I did not go to any, they didn't exist. There were no multiplexes yet. So every screen was big. And I remember going into a drive-in with my mother and, I don't know, one of her friends. I don't remember who I was with, or maybe it wasn't even my mother, but I do remember the experience of going into a drive-in movie theater. And the movie was called The Sky Above, the Mud Below. It had won an Academy Award for the best documentary. This is not a documentary you would see these days. And years later, I dated my obsession with certain images from Papua New Guinea from this film, because it was a documentary about these guys, these Frenchmen, going over the mountains. And there were all these images of dancing tribal people. I think they might have been related to the Dani, but there are so many different tribes there. I think they speak 900 languages on that island. And there were I remember coming in during this birthing scene. It wasn't an actual birth. It was the imitation of a birth with these people wearing something that looked like straw and such. And I remember that's where we came in, and we stayed and watched the movie again until we got to that point, and then we drove away. But I remember these scenes of, skulls. They were headhunters, and just weird, drumming and chanting and such, and it was just like, no one knew anything about this. But then again, I was living in Hawaii, in the South Pacific, essentially. It was a little north of the South Pacific, but basically it was the same Polynesian culture. And so to me, this was all part of my world. There were other islands where people did strange things. And so this was an important moment for me. I think as far as attracting me to certain kinds of images. Later I would see these kind of cannibal zombie films and feel like perfectly at home watching this stuff. But I remember, for instance, just going and seeing films like Dinosaurus, which was like a 1961-62 dinosaur film with really bad stop-motion animation, but I loved it as a kid. The story was not memorable at all, but I remember the final fight between a Tyrannosaurus and this old, I want to call it a bulldozer or something. It was a scraper, because it didn't look like anything today. It was, in 1962, all the construction equipment looked very different. But yeah, and then I remember my mom said, "Oh, I have to go take you. The Phantom of the Opera is back." And the way it used to work back then is that films would come back and back and back. So I saw many Disney films. Disney always put things on a 5-year cycle. So I remember seeing, Bambi while I was there, because it was on like a 5-year cycle. Every 5 years they'd re-release Bambi and get more money out of it, because this is, and they did this into the 60s because it was still a much better experience than anything on television, because television even into the 60s was black and white for the most part. But I also saw Gone with the Wind that way. I remember going to see Gone with the Wind near the end of my time in Hawaii, and it had been recycled again. And so, my first experience of that was big screen, The Burning of Atlanta, life size. So my mom wanted to take me to go see The Phantom of the Opera, and evidently she thought it was the 1940s version with Claude Rains. It wasn't. It was the new Hammer horror version with Herbert Lom as the Phantom. And my mother was petrified through the whole thing, because this wasn't the movie she remembered at all. That other one was like a romantic version with opera, and there was a moment at the end when the mask comes off and he's got a few marks on his face. Now, I didn't see at that time what the Phantom looked like with his mask off, because my mom was so afraid and had me so afraid. But the truth of the matter, it was his mask that was really the most frightening thing in the film. And actually, looking back, I thought it was pretty cool. I mean, it was a pretty dark, disturbing looking mask. Because of my mother's weird relationship to this movie, I think that gave me a connection to the movie that lasted, and different versions of the movie, of which the musical to me is about near the bottom. I'd much rather watch Brian De Palma's Phantom of the Paradise than watch the musical version. But Lon Chaney in the 1920s, that's the version. But we're not talking about the quality of the films, we're talking about the quality of the experience. And so I remember that experience. I remember practically where the movie theater was. I could practically walk there. It was up on a hill overlooking this larger area where there was a bit further down on this road was where the drive-in theater was. So I remember these kinds of things. There was a really nice theater in downtown Honolulu, about 4 or 5 blocks from where I used to live, in the last place we lived in Hawaii. And I won't go into my life in Hawaii, but I will tell you, we went to see The Longest Day, which was this film made by Daryl Zanuck of Fox Theaters, Fox Studios, 20th Century Fox. And it was a long film as well. And again, we arrived somewhere near the first, fifth of the film. And for some reason this often happened. People would just come in. They wouldn't be there at the beginning. They would just come in whenever they would come in, and they'd stay and watch it till the next film. And I remember it was a really long film. Now, I was being taken there, not by my mother, but by a friend of hers, someone she knew. I think it was actually the guy who lived across the street from me, this older teenage boy named Kelly. And I think that's what happened. He took me there. And, so we went there, the film ended, and then we had to wait again. We waited for an intermission, and then previews, and then the film starts. And I started to get really worried because we'd already sat through more than 2 hours of film, but it's a very long film. So we started to watch it again, and I started getting really nervous that it was all taking too long. So I got up and left the theater. And I left because I was afraid of getting in trouble for being there too long. And I remember walking home, and then everyone got really worried about, where did Bern go? We thought he just went to the restroom. That's life. Also there, I saw the original, the original 50s, late 50s version of Ben-Hur on wide, huge screens. And every now and then I'll watch it on a, fairly good size screen today. I have seen it once since then, in New York City on a big screen. But all I can tell you is that chariot race in that film is one of the most spectacular things ever filmed. And when you see it on a wide screen, it's absolutely incredible. I also saw movies. It was a time of sword and sandal movies. And I remember seeing films like Taras Bulba and the Vikings and the Mongols. And then there was a really cheesier one of David and Goliath. And I remember seeing all of these and thinking to myself, wow. These are, the quality varies on these different films, but it was a period, and I think it was the fact that we were coming out of this Roman epic period, so you had all these sword and sandal films, which I'll mention a bit more of in a minute. But this was also the period where I saw Fantasia, and here's all I remember from Fantasia. Not so much Mickey Mouse, not the elephants and hippopotamuses dancing. Dinosaurs, yes. Mickey Mouse himself, a little. It was the night on Bald Mountain, where you have Chernabog, the devil creature, coming out of the mountain, and that's what I remember. And then I remember the strange kind of monk-like figures at the end in a procession. But that's what I remember. That was incredible. It still is. I still think the night on Bald Mountain part of Fantasia is one of the most incredibly made scenes in any, not just any animated film, but any film ever. It's just incredible. Later I would find out that part of that was inspired by one of my favorite early stop-motion animators, Ladislav Starovich's film called The Mascot, and it has a scene where there's kind of a devil's ball in it, and there very definitely was a connection there. But that's something I had no idea. But I did see, like I said, more Disney stuff, Pinocchio and Sleeping Beauty. By the way, when I saw Bambi, I didn't go through the scarred thing that many people go through. I think it was probably because I was too young and it didn't register. I mean, it was just like, oh, Bambi's mother got shot kind of thing. But I didn't think of it as, I'd already seen The Sky Above, the Mud Below, which had, drums made out of lizard skin. So what in the world was Bambi's mother dying in a film going to do to scar me? Like I said, I was already attracted to the devil creature on the night on Bald Mountain. Not in any sort of weird way, but just because. Now, there are two films that I'll give a little extra mention to here. And one is The Magic Sword, which came out about 1961, and starred Basil Rathbone, and it was a sword and sorcery film. I think I saw it later also in California. And the other one, the most important one, was Jack the Giant Killer, which was, my adult brain can go back and look at that today and say, yeah, that wasn't the greatest film. But my child brain, remembering that film, looked back, and there are so many images that burrowed themselves deeply into my memory, became these archetypal images. And a lot of them have to do, there's the really strange image of witches and such there. There was just something about it. The actual actors doing the acting, but the strange imagery, the stop-motion creatures, the dancing toy that becomes a giant and has horns, it's just these kind of images, just seared into my mind, and I think as really deep symbolic representations. And I think one of the important things I learned from thinking about these early films, which I remember very well, is that many of the things we first see when we're young speak to us in different sorts of ways. And we get them lodged in our memories. And I think that what we see, what happens is, and I think it depends. Had my mother not chosen to take me to see the Phantom of the Opera would not be lodged in my mind in the same way. And the reason for it is because my mother had an odd relationship to that film. And so she passed that on in a way she had no idea. She was horrified by the film she actually took me to because it was so much different than the more romantic version from the 1940s. And I don't think she ever saw the Lon Chaney version. Ben-Hur, just that chariot race and everything. I mean, there's some wooden acting in Ben-Hur. There's a lot going on. I like Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur is great, but it's that the chariot race. It's the the guy, the hortator on the drum, ramming speed, and all of these things. Ben-Hur again. I think I came into Ben-Hur partway through and then sat through it around. I don't know why that was such a thing back then, but that lasted until through the 70s. You could do that. Nowadays, they really try to prevent you from doing that, at least in American and British and other sorts of theaters. They don't let you do that at all here in Georgia. So, but these early things, oh, there was one I forgot, Alakazam the Great, which turns out to be one of the very first anime-type films. And here you can really see the Disney influence. There's songs, and of course they turned it into an American version. And I'm still trying to I have a VHS version of it, but I'm still trying to find a DVD or Blu-ray version of it that has any version, but also especially one that has the Japanese version as well as the American version. And but there's something about that, and again, it's got a Night on Bald Mountain kind of flavor at the end of it. And this was before. What was interesting is that you get the big-eyed creatures that anime is known for, which is very influenced by Disney. It's not a Japanese creation. It's Japan after World War II saying we have to be more like the Americans. But then there's also this weird, like I say, it's Night on Bald Mountain imagery. And in fact, I'm sure they saw Fantasia and said, oh, and they didn't do the same thing because this was really a Buddhist story, the story of the Monkey King. But my goodness, that stuck with me a long time, which is why I treasure the VHS tape that I have so I can at least see it, but I'm looking for the real thing. And I found the Japanese version on Japan Amazon years ago, but it was like $50 to buy it. And I was like, Nowadays I might think about it, but still. Okay, it's time to move away from Hawaii and go to California. Why have I spent so long? Some of you who may not be familiar with the channel are probably wondering, like, why is he spending so long talking? Anyway, because if you look at this video, you see it's not going to be short. Because that's what this channel is about. It's not about, I'm not doing movie reviews much. I'm talking about the meaning of things. And what I'm really interested in here is the symbolic weight of things as they affect us in time. And so for me, these early films are some of the most important because obviously I'm going to see much better films later, but I'm not going to see films that influence me the same way. Even The Longest Day, I retain my interest in World War II very much. And we often forget this. We think that, what was it? I was just reading, there's this new Netflix series, Dahmer, which I haven't seen, which is obviously about a serial killer, Jeffrey Dahmer. And it's a series. And I saw some complaint saying, how could you show this film? My child, who's in 5th grade, is having trauma for it. And I'm sitting there going, what are you doing letting your child in 5th grade watch anything unmonitored that you have no idea what they're watching in this world today? That is silly. Because those images, that doesn't make your child a serial killer, but it's going to have an effect. And all early imagery has an effect. Particularly, it can have two different kinds of effect. One, it can make certain kinds of imagery that should be special into something that's totally not special. And I think that's the result of small screens. And the next thing, because with the small screen, we feel superior to it. You're watching something on a little screen. It doesn't matter. If you watch a movie or a TV show on a screen this big in your hand, that imagery does not matter. I remember watching what was it? I think I saw Carrie on television once, the Brian De Palma from the 1970s. Later, I saw it in a movie theater. The difference was night and day. In the movie theater, it's the same with Jaws, or later I saw King Kong. In a movie theater with a big screen, these things become powerful. Jaws really is frightening. Carrie, I mean, the scene where Carrie loses it at the prom, when you see it, like the split screen, on a wide screen, on a big screen, it's like, wow, your mind is blown. Sissy Spacek just becomes this iconic creature. But if you see it on something this big, what does that matter? It's like an annoyance in your brain. And people don't realize that. People think that, if I've seen it on my phone, I've seen it. To which my response is, no, you haven't. So let's move with me now. That's why I've spent time on this early stuff, because I think that's so important. Let's move with me now to where I lived for much of my childhood growing up, California. Okay, so I arrived in California in 1963. What's that? Yeah, 63 in March 1st, 1963. Because I know I was there for President Kennedy's death in November of 63. And at this point, I'm not going to talk about television much anymore, except to refer to it now and then, because it no longer matters. Like I said, the imagery I saw on television is nowhere near as intense, or the experiences I had watching television nowhere near as special as what I saw in movie theaters and my experiences at movie theaters. So there used to be this thing called the Saturday matinee. I don't know if they have it anywhere anymore. Probably not. And we could get into movies for 35 cents. Now, 35 cents was probably a couple of dollars, $2, $3 or more today. Maybe $5. Let's call it $5. But it was 35 cents. 1963 money. And it was like that for several years. Now, this was a show showing mostly for children, and there were so many films, like you'd see Three Stooges movies. I really loved watching Sword and Sandal or these Hercules type movies. They were also, now we look back and call these peplum films, because peplum was like the Greek dress that men wore. And we also would watch Disney films there. Oh, by the way, the sword and sorcery thing, there's still one film that really sticks with me that I can't find. And I've located many of these films because I get interested in stuff that interested me. And there's something about, many of these films were made in Italy. These Greek myth, sword and sorcery, the cheap versions, were made in Italy because they had a lot of stuff sitting around naturally. You know, there's Roman and Greek stuff in the environment near Italy or in Italy. So it was cheaper for them to make these films there. And they were done the Italian way, which is to say everybody just spoke all sorts of languages. And then they would make different versions. There's the English version, the Italian version, but they stripped the sound off for everyone. It's a very weird thing. I think they still do some variation on that process today in Italy. But I remember this one film, and it was just like there was an evil queen. There was like something that was underground caves. There were people trying to get out. There was, the whole place was being flooded at the end, and they were trying to escape. I remember there was a sacrificial character, and I know that there is a film that exactly matches this imagery in my mind, and I haven't found it yet. I am looking. I keep looking. I recently got another film, even here in Georgia, although I have most of the stuff. I have maybe 40 of these films. And I keep reading the descriptions and I can't find it. I'm thinking like, why? Because this was something I saw probably in 1963. And it's one of those things that stuck in my brain. And I want to know why, and I can't know why till I see the images again. This is very important when seeing something like I said, I used to see Disney films Saturday afternoon. So like, The Absent-Minded Professor, Son of Flubber, Follow Me Boys, these Fred MacMurray type films, which is funny now because now I think of Fred MacMurray. He used to be in this TV show, My Three Sons. Now I think of him primarily for Double Indemnity by Billy Wilder, where he really plays a mean, vicious kind of guy. And so it's very interesting to see him mutate into this sort of family man. But no, Mary Poppins came there. And here's the interesting thing. I saw Mary Poppins 4 times in the theater. I sat through it twice, because they would let you sit through the movies then. I sat through it twice on 2 different Saturday afternoons, because it stayed for several weeks. And I look back now and I realize my mother was having problems. And Mary Poppins was like this dream of a mother that you didn't have. And I think that's why it hit on a certain level. And you only realize this stuff when you look back at the things that, in a sense, called your attention. Particularly when you're young, you have the things that call your attention. And I think these are very important things because they represent symbols to you. Now, if I put my adult brain on and watch Mary Poppins, I go like, oh man, is this a bunch of romantic slush? It's just like, but when I put my child brain back on, I suddenly understand it all again. And this is actually the way I look at everything. I can look at it, for instance, I don't particularly like disco music, but if I put myself in the late 70s mindset and start listening to it again through different ears than mine, I suddenly understand why I Will Survive is a great song. I suddenly understand why I Feel Loved by Donna Summer is such a great piece of music. But then if I, for instance, put my punk brain on, which I do have kind of a punk brain in some place, I suddenly go like, what is this? and I do that with movies too. I inhabit the world of the movie. A lot of people come in looking for the things that relate to them. I go in looking for the things of the movie to expand what I understand about reality, not to confirm my own beliefs and fears. But as time went on, you go watch James Bond films. There might be a war film, these kinds of things. But in 1970, I became a Christian. And after that point, films ceased being interesting to me. Now, I became a Christian at the age of 15, so I had never seen any film prior to that point which could be called mature. Something not made for children, or not made with the whole family in mind. Although, I know, what was I doing watching The Sky Above, the Mud Below as they're killing the lizard and making a drum out of it, or as the children are sitting alone with the skulls at night and such. What was I doing watching that? Well, it's because no one thought that was a problem. And it isn't. It wasn't. Because that fed my imagination, in the best sense, for years. Well, so I went through this period that was kind of a drought in watching movies. And it became similar for listening to music as well, although I listened to more music because there was always a radio station on when you were driving. But I only saw a couple of films that I remember to any degree during this period, and one of them was another re-releasing of Gone with the Wind in Petaluma, California. And then I saw Serpico, which was a crime drama, and I think this was the first film I ever saw that had any sort of nudity in it, or rougher language, or serious gunplay and things like that. But it didn't stick with me. I don't have much of, it was kind of like some friend said, let's go watch this movie. And there's this young guy, Al Pacino, and he was in this film. But we saw it, but we didn't have a big discussion about it afterwards or anything. I don't know why we even went and saw it. It was R-rated, which in the 70s really meant something. But then I remember one of my first film experiences that caught my eye and my memory was in 1977, when, so I'm going from, do you hear what just happened? I went from 1970 with only a couple of film experiences, 1 or 2 weird Billy Graham films in the middle there, which they don't count as a film experience hardly. And And then, occasionally I'd see something on a passing. We didn't have a television in our Christian communes. So there's this whole period where it's kind of like maybe a blissful drought, because this is what really caused my... I think this was one of this and finding punk rock also in 1977. 77 was a very crucial year for me, because it was in 77 that I started realizing that we, who had largely come out of the hippie movement and tried to wrestle with the things from that, which included psychedelic drugs and Eastern religion and the occult and all of these things, didn't have any idea of what had developed in the second half, by the second half of the 70s. And I mean, even though we were living in the San Francisco Bay Area, it was no longer the Bay Area of the late 1960s. And I've discussed some of this stuff in other places, like my autobiographical question and answer video. But, yeah, so that film was Star Wars. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, oh, Byrne, you must have loved Star Wars. I liked it. Oh, I know the other one I saw. Jesus Christ Superstar. We felt obligated to go watch that. And that was a few years earlier than Star Wars. But again, I thought like, oh, okay. And we kind of we wondered, we thought, that's a kind of a weird version of the Christian story. And that's how we looked at it. We weren't the kind of... I'm making it sound like we were the kind of Christians who were totally against watching anything secular. We weren't. We didn't have those kind of fences set up. But we also didn't have an interest in it. I remember getting rid of my early rock music collection. No one was telling me I had to. I just did, because it was like, am I going to listen to Led Zeppelin again? As someone once said to me, do you think we're going to hear anyone screaming in heaven like in a Led Zeppelin song? And I said, yeah, probably not. And eventually I just got rid of most of my records, and then later kicked myself every time I had to buy one again. Long story. But, so I remember going to Star Wars. But here's the thing. I'd already read Chronicles of Narnia, and I'd read especially works like Lilith and The Golden Key by George MacDonald. These are such great, fantastic, imaginary worlds that Star Wars to me already at that point seemed cheap. It seemed, Wookiee is just a stupid name. Han Solo, it just sounded like a stupid name to me. Luke Skywalker, these didn't sound like interesting names. I was a little bit, what was I? About 21. But it was like, I never watched Sesame Street because it was too young for me already. But watching this, it's like I didn't have that experience that so many people had. Was like, oh my God, Star Wars! And a lot of people had that experience. But there weren't any Star Wars geeks yet. That's why everyone played with the toys, and they all became really valuable, because they all got used up in play. They all got damaged. People didn't buy the packages with the toys in them and put them on their walls and demonstrate them. That was late 80s by that time. So yeah, I saw Star Wars. But that got me thinking, and I also worked at a bookstore at the time where people would be talking about films as if they were important. Little did I know I was actually in the 1970s, which is one of the most crucial epochs for cinema in history, particularly in America. Little did I know I was there. Little did I, I would see occasionally people lined up to go see Jaws, or I would go see people lined up to go see The Godfather or The Exorcist. But I was like, these things probably aren't of much importance. But I was about to have my entire world shaken up. Why? Because I think the Star Wars thing kind of put in mind, it was like, I should go to a few more movies. And like I said, I was working at this bookstore where people were talking about movies like Taxi Driver, like these things were important. And I knew they weren't, but the way they were talking about it, I was like, maybe I should pay attention to this. I did already have this mindset, which I obviously still have, of, is that something that people are paying attention to? Maybe I should find out what's going on. Well, what had happened in the middle of the 1970s was that the first multiplexes had been born. And so I remember going to Santa Rosa, California, seeing a few movies there, The Gauntlet, Clint Eastwood movie, and taking a few of my Christian friends, and we thought that was an interesting movie. There are some very interesting Christian themes in almost every Clint Eastwood movie. Not because of Clint Eastwood as any sort of Christian, but because he's always having a dialogue, in a sense. If you watch enough Clint Eastwood movies, you'll notice almost everyone has something Christian going on in it, and sometimes he's very critical, and sometimes he's not, which I find really fascinating. But that's Clint Eastwood. But I was seeing that even then. And then I remember, there was another weird science fiction film not worth looking for called Damnation Alley. But what I remember most about going, Bridge Too Far was a big event for me. And I remember it was long enough that they had an intermission in it. And in the intermission, I suddenly thought, like, wow, World War II, am I ever going to get out of this? Because it felt like that in the film. I was just trapped inside of this. Well, one of the things I really remember from going to this particular multiplex was not the movies so much, but the music they played between it. And they often played the soundtrack, the score to The Godfather, which is an incredible score by Nino Rota. And they would play this. And I got to the point, it's not that long, it's about a half hour. So I was at that theater enough that I would just be like, and this really kind of started pointing me towards movie scores, which later became very important to me. But, and films don't do this anymore. Now it's in America. What they do is they have these slides often, and they will they went through a period where they had games you would play or quizzes they would give you, but advertisements, and they'd use up all this time with these slides to advertise to you, and because people couldn't sit alone in the quiet like you can in Georgian theaters now, which I love. I love just sitting in a quiet room, especially if I'm like the only person there, which happens quite a bit, because I often go in the middle of the day, and Georgians go to movies in the evening. So we don't listen to scores the way that theater was, and this theater was nothing special at all. It wasn't like a repertory theater, which I'll mention in a moment. But there was another one of these theaters in Petaluma, California. It was new. It was in some sort of strip mall, and they put a twin theater there. And they had a couple movies they were showing one day, and one of them was Murder by Death, which is kind of a comedy of sort of a whodunit comedy with Peter Sellers and Peter Falk and some other interesting people. And they were also showing Taxi Driver, to which I thought, well, I'd heard that was an interesting film, so I decided to go into this double bill. And when I went in, I realized I was somewhere in the middle of Taxi Driver. Now I could tell you exactly where I was. It was right before the grocery store attack and what happened after that, the little convenience store. But when I went into this dark, overwhelming mood of this film, I'd never seen anything like this. Keep in mind, this is the first serious R-rated film I have seen ever in my life. Now, like I said, I did see Serpico and such. I think Bridge Too Far might have been rated R because of a lot of bloodshed, and it had its gory moments. But this was the first serious film I had ever seen. Certainly the first film I would call an art film. A film which, by the way, is still in my top 10 of movies from all time. And I think part of it is because of the way it affected me. Well, there was just me and a couple of other guys sitting in... It was just like one of these empty theaters. Me and a couple of guys sitting off to the side watching this film. And it gets to the end. And if you've ever seen Taxi Driver, you know it doesn't end well. That is to say, before the weird thing at the end with the taxi, the whole shootout at the end is just a nightmare. Now, I've never seen anything like this. And the way the effects were done was just absolutely incredible, absolutely gory. The subject matter is just the seediest New York stuff, prostitutes, pimps, and politics, all mixed up. And I'm watching this thing, and then suddenly the shootout at the end comes, and it goes on, and it's just the most nightmarish thing I've ever seen. And these two guys over in the corner are laughing their asses off during the entire shootout scene. Now, all the way through the movie, this guy Travis, of what I saw at that time, but it was clear, he was coming from some sort of Christian background. Later I found out Paul Schrader, this was basically his story of coming out of Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, having been a Christian but having abandoned most of his faith. And essentially he was putting his character, and he himself spent time just driving around endlessly in Los Angeles, but he put himself in many ways into that character. And as I was watching this film, listening to these guys laughing, you have to remember, I'm not a cynical modern person. I've been in Jesus People communes for the last 7 years. I've grown, the second half of my adolescence has been largely involved here. I'm about 21 years old, 22 years old. And I am sitting there saying to myself, what is wrong with these people? How can they laugh at this bloodshed? Now, my brain today tells me there were two possibilities. One, they were film students and were appreciating the incredible film work that was being done at that point. Or two, more likely, they were stoned out of their minds. But I started to get up out of my seat. And as I did, I suddenly checked myself. I was going to say, how can you laugh? This isn't funny. I suddenly checked myself. And I said, and I realized, they're going to see that I'm just like him if I do this. Because he has a vague notion of morality that he is operating on, and it's driving him crazy. And if I stand up, I will look like him to them. So I thought to myself, well, what do I do? And I sat down, and I realized they've got us. We can't comment anymore because we will look mad, insane. As we've often been interpreted, anyone coming from a Christian perspective, when you tried to make a moral point. And I sat down to myself and I said, we, in our Christian world, have so isolated ourselves that we no longer know how to communicate with these people. And it was I remember walking out of that film saying, I stayed for the next film, but they didn't show it over again, so it was years until I could see the first part again. Because this was at a small, this Twin Theater was a small place that showed movies near the end of their run. So the film had been out for almost a year already by that time. But I thought, I have to do something about this. I need to understand film. And this was around the same time that I had the same observations about music and punk rock, and I said, I need to understand this. I understood a certain amount growing up about music in the San Francisco Bay Area, but suddenly I just said, okay, the society has changed, and we haven't noticed it, because we think it's the same society that we were in the early 70s, and it's not. So Taxi Driver was like a major influence on, and that particular showing was a major influence on my development. And I will always thank Martin Scorsese for that, because I think Martin Scorsese always has been wrestling with his faith. And kind of stuck between his faith on one side and the violence of the world on the other. And I haven't always agreed, in fact, rarely agreed with his conclusions. But I see him as an honest person wrestling with his experiences.
all my life needed was a sense of someplace to go. I don't believe that one should devote his life to morbid self-attention. I believe that someone should become a person like other people.
And which led me to start going to, in our theater, there had been a theater called the State Theater, which had gotten really run down. And it was actually a very beautiful double-story theater inside. And I remember, for instance, there were still a few of these movie palaces in existence at the time. And one was the Fox Warfield Theater, which is where my mother took me to see The Sound of Music in 1965 when it came out. Absolutely amazing experience going into this. But this State Theater in Petaluma was actually quite a fascinating theater inside, but it had devolved into a porno theater. And I remember at one point whenever this happened in the early 70s, walking by, there was a huge line to get into this porno theater, and I said, "What is this?" And they said, "Oh, it's Deep Throat." And I said, "Oh, what is that about?" And it was from the period where porn was now they call it porno chic during this period. It wasn't called that during the time. Then it was just called porno films, But what happened near the end of the 70s was that the State Theater was bought and turned into a repertory movie house. Now, a repertory movie house is something that only exists really in this narrow window between the mid-70s mostly. There may have been some earlier, but they go through about the mid-80s before they start dying out. And although there still are some in existence, but it became much less common. And what this was, you see, there weren't videotapes really yet. What few did exist by the late 70s really weren't watching, and video systems were really expensive to buy. The repertory theater allowed films to come back, and good repertory movie theaters had good minds putting the films together. And so it was very important to put the films together in a really clever way. So I have never, for instance, seen Godfather 1 and 2 without seeing them together, because some genius at this the theater in our town was called the Plaza Theater. They renamed the State Theater into the Plaza Theater. And you went inside, and it was actually this beautiful theater inside. And I saw a lot of films there. They had midnight showings of like Rocky Horror Picture Show and Eraserhead and stuff like that. They also had great... You see, what you have to understand about the 1970s was for film, this was the period where film became something that people became interested in as an art form in America. And I think it happened earlier in Europe. In fact, I'm sure it did. But, so you had the first generation of people actually going to film schools to learn about film history. You had critics like Andrew Saras and Pauline Kael writing about film for different companies. You had magazines like Film Quarterly, and more importantly, the Film Comment magazine, which I collected until the end of the run, essentially, at which they also just became too politically correct for my taste, which sadly has happened in too many institutions. I remember that this place, the Plaza, they would sell you, for instance, you could buy a block of tickets and get in for like $2 or $1 or $2 a piece for the movies. If you bought a big enough block, you got in for free. So I remember going to see, this is where I first saw King Kong life-size. And I realized all the times I had seen it on television before that didn't count. Because seeing King Kong, 10 meters, 30 feet tall in front of you was an absolutely fantastic experience. And it gave me a world of respect for what these films used to look like. And I really am grateful for those repertory theaters. I also saw, weird stuff like Pink Flamingos, which I don't recommend at all, but just really, I was honest. I was going, what is happening in our time? So I would go to see films. And I remember reading in Film Comment magazine about this important film called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, I'm just listening to the name of this thing and going like, ugh. Now, I liked kind of creepy horror films, saw a lot of, Frankenstein and Dracula films on television as a kid, and there's a whole thing there where I got kind of afraid of some of them. I remember once, this back in my youth in California, watching, I would sneak watching like horror films on television. It was a lot of the cheesier stuff from the 1950s, but also the early stuff from the 30s and such. And I remember watching this one crazy film from the early 1960s called The Monster of Piedras Blancas. And it was a really creepy creature from the Black Lagoon kind of monster. But you could tell there's something weird about this. Later you realize they cut out the scene where he was holding this man's head in his hands and such. But it just felt like such a strange film. And that's one of the first films to really give me the creeps. Like I say, all the Frankenstein Dracula stuff, but this was kind of weird. And then I also subscribe to Famous Monsters of Filmlands. Those of you who know what I'm talking about. Sometimes they have these interesting films on late at night after the news. So I remember there was going to be this one with a weird name late at night. So I'm watching it, and the name of the film comes on, and then there's this weird kind of like map and all of this stuff, and then it starts to go into this strange exotic world, and I got so afraid I turned it off. It was actually Casablanca. I just found that really funny. But the feverish machinations of a child's mind. But it was at this Plaza theater in Petaluma, which no longer exists as such, which I saw the Texas Chainsaw Massacre double billed with The Hills Have Eyes, but only after having the entire thing spoiled for me by reading a detailed analysis, not review, in Film Comment magazine. But I could tell by reading this thing, and I did that on purpose to get myself ready for it. People say, oh, spoiler warning. And I'm like, sometimes I'm like, no, spoil it. Do I need to go? If you don't spoil something, I don't know if I need to go. For certain films, So, The Hills Have Eyes came on first, Wes Craven. And I watched it with new eyes because I'd been reading film criticism and stuff. And suddenly I saw it as like, oh, this whole thing is like a parable. And, there's two dogs, German shepherds, that this family traveling through the desert has. And one is called Beauty and the other is called the Beast. Well, guess which one survives at the end? It ain't Beauty. But I started seeing this, and in between that, I remember turning to the people who were sitting next to me, and my brain was like on fire with ideas. And I said, what is all this stuff about? Little did I also know I was in the middle of perhaps the most important period for horror films as well. And then came the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Well, I'm not going to go in and talk about all my thoughts about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. All I will tell you is it was like an explosion went off in my brain. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is still one of my number one top 10 films of all time. And people will say to me, really? And I'll say watch it. It still holds up very, very strongly. So, let's leave California and let's talk. But before I do, let me just mention drive-in movie theaters because they used to have those there. And like I said, they were in Hawaii. But I went to more in California. And then there was a weird thing that happened. They started putting porno films in drive-in movie theaters. And I remember driving down the highway and you're kind of like going quickly by on Highway 101 and there's just like, huh? And it would just be like this quick image. And people who, evidently, I never did this obviously, but people go off into the hills and just watch these things quiet because, who needs the dialogue? Well, the drive-in theaters, I highly recommend Joe Bob Briggs describing life in drive-in theaters. And there still are some in America, particularly in places like Texas, somewhere, because it's a perfect way to go. Now, a lot of people think, yeah, it's all about sex and stuff. And it's like, no, it isn't. What I remember was more about families. And people get their kids in the car, and they'd all go. And then you go off to the where the projection booth was, and they'd have like some sort of little cafeteria there. And you get stuff like the hot tamale and all of this kind of things, which I still have very fond memories of. And I remember watching the original Mad Max in a drive-in movie theater in about 1979 in Petaluma, California. And the interesting thing was, I thought, well, this is an interesting film, but why have they got this weird... The dialogue seemed really strange to me. And I felt like, why are they driving on the wrong side of the road? It took me a while to figure out that was actually Australia. And what they'd done is strip the dialogue of all the Aussie stuff, because in 1979, no one could understand Australians, and put this whole American dialogue soundtrack over Mel Gibson, which is really funny. But no, drive-in movie theaters were an experience all their own. And again, I saw The Sky Above, The Mud Below at a drive-in movie theater. It's one of my first experiences. So I always have a warm place in my heart for drive-in movies. After California, I spent a year in Europe at Le Brie in Switzerland. During that period, I didn't see any movies. Nothing. Yeah, there was one movie I saw. Yeah, The Deer Hunter, at a theater in Lausanne, Switzerland, which was a very intense film. And I have seen several movies over the years in my trips through Europe. And I will say this, there's a big difference between European theaters and American theaters. And that is, people will often walk out of European theaters. If it's kind of a dark, depressing movie, they'll walk out in kind of a dark, depressing mood. They'll walk out in a kind of quiet, somber mood over a film Americans will be laughing at. So that's one thing. But then I went back to California, and I spent another 6 months or so there, where I really, in earnest, began studying film, using the Plaza Theater and their discount passes as my library. And that's where I really started to understand cinema. And in fact, I took notes. The last period before I went to Europe and when I came back, I took all these little notes. I still have all the notes. At this point, the notes don't mean much to me because I already understand these things, but I was training my mind to notice things, and that was important. And then I moved to New York City. And now, Technicolor when it comes to movie-going experiences. So let's think about, when I first got to New York City, I wanted to see a lot of movies that were coming out. Of course, this was the 80s, and a lot of people see, the 80s as, Indiana Jones, E.T., Back to the Future. And I saw that stuff. But I soon realized I needed to see some other stuff too. And including films which I needed to watch a lot more European films and catch up on that. And I also needed to see films on the other end of the scale, the stranger, more exploitation aspect. I need to catch up on some of that stuff too, which you only got occasionally at drive-ins back in California. So Quentin Tarantino talks about the Grindhouses. Now, Grindhouses are kind of the urban twins of the drive-in movie theater. And the Grindhouse, basically, they call it a Grindhouse because a film plays, then comes the previews for the next film, then the next film plays, then more previews for the next film's coming attractions, or even not so much advertising, but then more. It never stops. So it just grinds out the films. And good luck using the schedule on the outside at the ticket booth to tell you where it is. Now, the ones I went to mostly were at around the corner from Times Square on 42nd Street. Now, there were a lot of grindhouses in this area. And there were also a lot of porno theaters, and sometimes they switched between the two, although that was always an unpleasant experience. And now, I didn't go to watch the porno movies, but I did go to watch the strange stuff coming to the grindhouses, which included lots of action films, kung fu films, which I only watched a handful of because they didn't interest me as much. A lot of horror films, science fiction films, sometimes films like The Elephant Man, which was surprisingly popular in a place like a grindhouse. Well, I had some experiences in these places that I simply will never, ever forget. Because these places, unlike the places around the corner on 42nd Street, were not at all. This was not tame cinema going. This was not polite cinema going. You had a lot of black folks there. You had a lot of Hispanic folks there. You had street folks there. You had, criminals trying to get in off the streets to hide from the cops. You had the stickiest floors in the world. And they never had rugs on them because, someone had to come in at the end of the day with like some sort of high-powered stuff. But, but they were amazing theaters inside. There was these big theaters. One of them, the New Amsterdam, became the Disney show place. But I remember seeing movies in the New Amsterdam theater. And it was a fantastic place to see films in before it became an actual stage theater. I mean, it was a serious, beautifully constructed theater before it became this grindhouse. And some of the others were like that as well. So, and the audiences were never afraid to talk to the screen. Now, this was totally different than going to, say, a university crowd. Like, I remember going to see some films in Berkeley, California when I was back in the San Francisco Bay Area. And there, the audiences would laugh. They were always hipper than thou. They would, if they saw something in a movie, they would be kind of, but they were always kind of like superior to the film. Whereas the audiences in the grindhouse were never superior to the film. They were involved with the film. So if someone makes, like in a horror film, goes the wrong way, the people in the audience will say, no! They'll all it's like, don't do it! But, I loved it. Or if something bad happened, you could hear this collective, 300 people all at once go, oh, shit! Just like this wave of sound. Then you get stuff like, I remember seeing the first Terminator movie there. And Arnold Schwarzenegger gets shot. And he's bleeding, and someone calls out, walk it off, Arnie, walk it off! And then there was another movie where, it may have even been the same thing, but there was another movie where someone just kept saying, it was in the upper balcony, kept saying, 24 hours until the end of time. And then went on, during this thing, they kept going 10 hours and 11 minutes before the end of time, and this count, and someone just yelling this out every now and then. I mean, they're just wild places. One of the strangest ones, though, now, one of the reasons why the people in the audience could not feel superior to the films is because some of these exploitation films could wipe you out. I mean, these were not polite film-going experiences in any degree. I remember, though, seeing this really, really, really terrible dinosaur movie starring Ringo Starr called Caveman. That's as much as I need to say about it. But I was there, and there was a Hispanic man and his son, who was probably about 10 years old, with him. And then that movie ends, and then the next movie starts, and it's showing us previews for coming attractions. And one of these previews is for a film called Savage Man, Savage Beast, which is a documentary. Is it really a documentary? But it has Later they would make all these faces of death things, but this was kind of like before that and much more intense than that. And we're watching this, and pretty soon you're seeing in the trailer itself, you're seeing soldiers in the jungle whacking off the, shall we call them, the male members, and sticking them into people's dead soldiers' mouths. You're watching a lion rip a man apart. This is in the trailer. And the guy turns to his son and says, don't look. It's too late. The son's already got it. This is life in the inner city. Absolutely amazing. And at the same theater, in the same show, I was about 5 rows back, sitting next to this guy. Suddenly, 3 rows in front of me, 2 rows of people immediately clear out. And I'm like, what's going on here? And I turn to the guy, do you know what's going on? Or I turn to the person in front. I said, what's going on? He goes, oh, the guy has a gun. And then we went back to watching the film. Someone has a gun. It's just like, this happens. That's what the Grindhouse was like. I mean, this is, like I say, this is not your typical experience. My all-time moment for going to the Grindhouses was the following. A double bill of The Evil Dead, the first film, which had come out a couple years earlier, with this was the premiere night, the opening night for A Nightmare on Elm Street, the first one. And the theater was packed. It was a Friday night. And actually, I found out later as I was leaving that Wes Craven was actually there watching the audience. And I'm sure he got a great show. Along with Shay, who, I can't remember his first name, but the guy who was the person behind what's the word? Owner, director, manager, the producer from New Line Cinema. Robert Shea, I think it was. I would meet him later at an autograph session at Forbidden Planet. But anyway, there's at this point, this is way before Lord of the Rings. They're a very small operation, and in fact, Nightmare on Elm Street is going to make their day for a long time, and the whole series is. So they're back there watching what I'm watching. Now, The Evil Dead comes on first. And this is a packed house of people who talk to the screen. And at a certain point, as Joe Bob Briggs says in his drive-in reviews, there's only one thing you can do with these zombies, and that's total dismemberment. And then there's a point at which Ash, his girlfriend, he gets kind of teary-eyed, and then doesn't cut her up, and then eventually he has to, as Joe Bob Briggs says, make like a butcher at a Safeway, And there's a scene where he's cutting up the zombie of his girlfriend. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. Here's what I remember: the entire audience either sitting down, many of them on their feet, all making this chopping motion all at once, going like, whoa, go, go, go. Just because they're all feeling these demonic zombies' presence themselves. The world is a tough place, and you need to get rid of them, and you can't go halfway. So but it's like the whole audience is raised up, going, go, go, go. And then there's a couple of, trailers in between. And then comes Nightmare on Elm Street. And this was the most primed audience I've ever seen for something like that. And, given all of the things that happened in that film, this audience was just collectively one in a way I've rarely seen it. And some people might say, these are usually a certain kind of tame moviegoer. It's just like, I wish they'd be quiet so I could watch the movie. That's not what this experience was about. This was an experience about participating in the movie so that Freddy doesn't get you, so that the demon zombies and Evil Dead don't get you. This was life lessons. And I am sure Wes Craven walked out of that screening that night happy. happy as he could possibly be, because this audience just loved this thing, Nightmare on Elm Street. So that was one of the highlights of my film-going life right there. Now, there were repertory theaters there, like the Thalia, and I can't remember all the names, but I certainly remember Film Forum, which exists to this day, although they tend to show more. They have a multiplex now, and they show more films as individuals, although they still will have festivals. But I remember the Film Forum in different locations. And there was one way down near Canal Street, and I don't remember what exactly the street they were on right off the top of my head. But that's where I saw Tarkovsky's Stalker with my friend John Pomaro, who is an artist. And we walked out of that kind of like, oh, that was really interesting. And that was the first Tarkovsky film I'd ever seen. Later, I would see them all. But I remember I didn't walk out saying that was the best film I ever saw, although that's precisely what it is to me right now. But I remember saying to myself, that was really unusual. The slow camera movements, it was in Russian. It was like, what was this about? I felt that there was much more there. I would eventually see the film, I think, what was it? About 6 or 7 times in the theaters. Once I went with my Russian friend Sergei, and we went again to the Film Forum several years later, but I saw it in other theaters as well. And he says to me, Byrne, I understand why you're here. You like Russia, but why are these other people here? They don't understand what they're looking at, which was probably a very astute observation. Nevertheless, enough people over time have been captivated by the very slow-moving Stalker to elevate it to the ranks that I think it belongs as one of the greatest films ever made. Another experience I had, I'll get back to the Film Forum in a minute, but another experience I had, which was also very important, was when I said, okay, there are other films by Tarkovsky, and then I saw, Andrei Rublev, about this Russian icon painter in the Middle Ages, is going to be showing up at the Thalia Theater up in the Upper West Side. And so I went there. Now, this wasn't even a complete version. I think this was maybe 2.5 hours. It's much closer to 3 hours, or actually more like 3.5 hours. So it wasn't a complete version, and some parts of it, you could tell they cobbled together different versions to try to make the most complete version. It would take years to get the most complete version, which is why I kept going back to see it, waiting to see the next version. But I remember this was a story about someone losing their faith and losing their reason to do art. And maybe it was just the time that I'd spent in New York City. Not that I was losing my faith, but you could feel that pressure. And when that film was over, again, not talking about the actual content of the films, I'm talking about the experience of the film. I remember I got outside. Now this was at 96th Street, and I just started walking. And when I got to 42nd Street, I got to a payphone and called a friend and said, I have to tell you about this film I just saw. And she said, what was it? And I said, it was this Russian film called Andrei Rublev. Andrei Rublev remains in my top 3 or 4 of all time, as does Stalker. So, very important film-going experiences there. Meanwhile, back at the Film Forum, this is where I first ran into the films of Jan Schwenkmeyer or the Quay brothers. Lots of foreign films, and lots of silent films. They really did a great job of having silent films. Unfortunately, I ruined the effect for someone, because I always know that silent films need music. And they often had someone playing live. And I went to one show and brought a friend because I was so like, we have to see this silent film, Alita, Queen of Mars from Russia. And so we went there. But there was no one playing the piano, and they had no background score. And so it was just completely silent. And my friend was just like, I can't stand this. And she never wanted to see another silent film again. And I felt bad because, oh man, if only there was a score to that. Well, I'd seen a couple of other films like that. I actually kind of liked the experience of just watching totally quietly. But that isn't normal for silent films, really. But And there's still films that I've seen there, documentaries. One called The Yellow Cruise, which is not a cruise at all, but it's a story about taking this half car, half tank by Citroën from Iraq all the way to Beijing, China, over through Afghanistan and over the Karakoram Mountains or something like this. This just completely blew my mind. I've been looking for this documentary ever since. I've looked in French sources, I've looked in American sources, looked to see if it ever existed, because this film completely, utterly blew my mind. It was made in the 1930s. And there were quite a few things that I saw there that I'm still looking for the DVDs or the Blu-rays of, because they were such interesting films. And these films just don't show up anywhere. And that's how good the Film Forum was at getting things to show people. They had such a good, at least at that period, they had such a good, this was the 80s and 90s. They had the programmer who scheduled the films coming. These people were brilliant. And I don't think it continues quite the same way, any more than Film Comment continued the same way over time. But nevertheless. So, I've never considered myself a film geek. And a film geek to me is someone who goes and watches all the stuff. They go to all the festivals. They like to really, hone in on it. Because I consider film just an art, not the art. And I think that, for instance, also, when I've gone to films with, and sometimes you get these crowds at the Film Forum, absolutely the opposite of the Grindhouse crowds. These would be people who know everything about film. And so they tend to laugh at inappropriate moments. This is a reason I don't like going to hip college crowds and watching a film. Well, this was then. Who knows what it's like today, if it even happens anymore like that. But for instance, if I watch a film noir, some sort of crime film from the 40s or 50s, and if I'm watching it with a particularly knowledgeable or university-type audience, they will laugh at all the wrong places. They will laugh because they can't believe people were saying or doing that. And this I remember once, this was actually at the Plaza Theater in California. They were showing The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And this man was talking about, what are you going to do with all your gold? He goes I want to go back and I want to start a ranch, and I want to have orange groves and pick oranges or something like this. And the audience is just absolutely laughing. Because, of course, that's just the work for migrant Mexican laborers. And they don't get what the guy is saying. This is the problem with hyper self-consciousness and postmodern irony, is that you start looking for all the ways in which you are superior to the film, or that this. It's like I say, I think those guys at that original Taxi Driver showing that I saw were inflicted in some degree with this kind of thing. Which is why I much prefer an audience like at the Grindhouses, where they're not afflicted by this curse at all. Yeah, maybe it's noisy, and it isn't the place for contemplation, but it is the place to experience a movie. And I remember at Film Forum, one particular showing that was, they showed Les Yeux Sans Visage, Georges Franju's, also Eyes Without a Face, Georges Franju's horror film, which for years had never been seen anywhere. And they were showing it, a new print of it. And many times these new prints would end up over on Kino Cinema, which had some sort of connection with Film Forum, not directly though. And, but this was a weird thing. For instance, there were scenes in that movie where the audience, this is a 1960 movie, made the same year as Psycho. 1960 has three of the most important movies in horror film history: Psycho, Eyes Without a Face, and Peeping Tom by Michael Powell. And all of them are very intense films, even to this day. But so this is the first time anybody has seen this. And there were moments while watching this where half the audience is laughing at something and the other half is screaming. And of course, the ones who are screaming are the ones who've never seen anything like this. And the ones who are laughing are the far too hip. I wasn't doing either. I was just like in awe of this film. And Eyes Without a Face remains number 2 or 3 in my all-time list of great films. So as you can see, seeing films in a movie theater really imprints it upon you in a way that watching it on a screen doesn't. And I did have, what would be called today film geek experiences, where there would be someone from who was involved in the making of the film there to talk with you. And I remember a particularly good one at the Museum of Modern Art where Catherine Bigelow was talking about her first film, Loveless. And this was after her second film, Near Dark, which I already at that point considered a great film. And later she would go on to make things like Zero Dark 30 and other important films. But I would go, and I did have a chance to ask, my 2 cents worth, get in the line and such. But I find that those things are not nearly as interesting as experiences. They could be, it makes you feel part of something to be in, if you're getting educated or something. But my feeling is that those other experiences I discussed, where the film hits you, or it hits the audience in a certain way. I mean, I remember walking out of Pasolini's Salo. If you have any idea what I'm talking about right now, I'm not going to go into talking about it too much. You'll know that I basically had to scrape myself out of the movie theater and just push my carcass along the sidewalk as I left. And so did everyone else. And I remember those kinds of experiences. There were European films from the 70s that were particularly existentially bleak. But that was important for understanding things. People will often say to me, Bern, how can you understand? How do you know all this stuff? And I says, hard work is the answer to the question. I didn't just pop into my mind. I'm not a film geek, because I'm not any kind of geek when it comes to understanding things. Because I don't make fun. I don't spend time, playing guessing games with, what are the top 5 this, or what's the most... I'm interested in what the most important films are. I'm interested in the most meaningful things. I'm interested in an intellectual way. I'm interested in as far as how these things relate to our lives and how we relate to images. But I'm not interested in making games out of these things. I'm not interested in getting my identity from films. I get my identity from walking. And interestingly enough, there was one other experience I have to mention. I actually got my name in the New York Post and a little clip of an interview with me for watching all 11 plus hours of Werner Fassbinder's Berlin Alexanderplatz, which was a German television show which had never been on American television. This was about 1983 or 84. I watched it overnight. Now, I don't know why they started it at they started at 6 o'clock at night and it went all the way till 12 the next day. Why not start it at 6 in the morning? Then I can get out at midnight. But anyway, that was quite an interesting experience, staying up all night for that, and there were breaks. So it ended up taking us about 16 hours with all the breaks. But I got interviewed, why are you doing this? That's how dedicated I was. I think my quote was, I couldn't find anyone to come with me. Deep. But that's how committed I was to learning about cinema and trying to understand it, that I would watch something that long. I mean, I'd watched Godfather 1 and 2 together before, and that was 7 hours. I had even gone to 3 movie showings and such that were longer. But, that's my record right there. But later, I moved to Alaska. I spent time traveling through Europe. And it ended up here in Georgia. And you want to know something? I haven't had any of those experiences since the 90s. Why? Video, DVDs, Blu-ray, downloading, streaming. That's why. Yeah, I still see great movies. And I will go to movie theaters here. But the movie theaters here and in Europe, very quiet affairs. It's rare you get much happening. I think I saw one movie recently, I can't remember what it was even, where the audience kind of applauded at the end. But I suspect there were a bunch of Americans in that audience. And again, it doesn't even strike me well enough to know what it was. I will see movies that I really like. I prefer seeing movies in the theater. But then again, I'm watching digital projections. And if you know anything about the difference between digital projections and film projections, you'll know there's something right there that isn't the same. And I'm not going to go into describing that because this is not what this is about. What this has been about is I want you to think about the experiences in your own life, not only with movies you've seen, and it can include things on television for certain. It's not that these things don't affect you, it's that they don't have the same punch that certain experiences in theaters will have. And I find many of these films have stuck with me to become symbolic milestones because I've seen them in theaters and because they were of the environment in which I saw them. So I don't know if we can get that experience back. Maybe there's some colleges that are showing interesting films. If there are, let me know. Maybe there are still repertory theaters that show, have really well thought out programs. If they are, let me know. And I'm looking forward to having some interesting film experiences here, movie theater experiences. For instance, I've seen one film, part of a film festival here, that was nice, but not particularly memorable. I'm going to see a friend of mine's 10-minute animation film around the 5th of November at a festival. I'm looking forward to that. Will it be this kind of event? One can hope. Well, I hope you found that interesting. And there's something about the real-world experience. And while some people have argued that the movie theater is like a dream, I think we can say, yeah, in a way it is. Seeing David Lynch's Eraserhead in a movie theater was very dreamlike. But you're sharing your dream with people. But here's another thing. If the movie theater is like a dream, what is the television screen at home? Or the laptop, or the pad, or the smartphone in your hand? What are those things? Well, that is a big question. I have dealt with some of this over on the Anadromist. Go rifle around through the older videos there. I always make them to be perennial so that they're always good. And thank you for joining me. And from Tbilisi, this is Bern saying droebit, which is their word meaning temporarily. We'll just be gone from each other for a little while, and then we will meet again.
When I go, I want you to give me 5 minutes. I told you boys I'm no escape artist. For the first time, I like the odds.
At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls.